Hello and welcome to week 4 of English 1301. This week we are beginning our second module. Hopefully you have already turned in essay number 1 and I'll be working to get those back to you as soon as possible and allow revisions for that. All right, let's take a look at module 2. We're starting with essay number 2. It's our evaluation essay. So, for this essay, we're going to be evaluating something that everybody has experienced in one form or another parenting methods. But before we get into the parenting methods, let's go over what is an evaluation essay. All right, so an evaluation is basically your opinion based on information provided to you. You are giving your evaluation, your opinion, so that someone can judge for themselves. This could be part of your job in the future. You will probably be asked to evaluate things all the time. We certainly evaluate things all the time. When you wake up in the morning, you evaluate whether or not you want to jump out of bed or not. You evaluate, especially on days like today, how cold it is outside, so what you're going to wear, what you're doing that day, etc. When you are driving or in a car, you evaluate this, the situation usually within a split second. You have to evaluate whether the car uh, across from you is going to turn in front of you, whether or not the light is green or red, whether the person sitting on the curb is going to step off at any given second. There's so many things that we evaluate all the time. It's literally what we do. So don't get upset when someone asks you to actually codify your evaluation into a paper. That's what we are doing here. It is just another type of argument that you are giving evidence for to support your opinion, your evaluation. All right, so for this particular evaluation, we're going to be looking at a parenting model that will be discussed in one of the readings that we're going to have in the next week or so. When you evaluate something, you argue whether it's good or bad, right? You're giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. You could give it somewhere in the middle, but for the sake of our purposes, we're going to be actually making a argument for good or bad. You're going to have to take a stance for this. Uh, and it doesn't matter. I know we're going to be evaluating parenting. It doesn't matter if you're a parent or not. You have been parented in some form or fashion throughout your life. So you have opinions on it, and those opinions are valid. But what we're going to ask you to do is to look at 3 different types of parenting, and you're going to make an evaluation of them based on those articles. Before we get too far ahead, though, let's talk about what makes an evaluation. Again, you evaluate things all the time. You are constantly evaluating your situation. Uh, what we usually use is we have to come up with a set of things to judge that evaluation by, and those are usually called criteria. For example, let's take a cell phone. Let's say you are in the market for a new cell phone. There are certain things about your cell phone that you want it to have. For example, you might want to have a long battery life. You might want it to have a really good processor so that it can go out into the internet and process the information pretty quickly. You want to be able to go out to the internet. You want it to have a lot of memory so that you can do you're actually going out on the internet and looking at things. Oh, or for all the apps that you might want to use on it. Some people really require that their cell phone have the ability to play a lot of games. So you want it to have those abilities. You want it perhaps to come with a good sound system built into the phone so that when you listen to music, you have the ability to uh, really shape it to what you want it to sound like or that it sounds good at all. Outside speakers, also a consideration. Obviously, you want the screen to be touchable and usable, and actually screens have gotten a lot better about being a little more durable, right? That's one of the things. We're all going to drop our phone. We want to make sure it doesn't absolutely shatter the first time it hits a bump. And also, You want to know that you're going to have plenty of coverage and that it's not going to uh, just kind of fizzle out in important parts. You want to make sure that when you're using the mapping feature or the mapping apps, that it's just not going to lose signal. So there's all of these things that we require in a phone are called the criteria. It's the criteria that we use to evaluate each phone. Also price. Probably somewhere in there is price. So we do this every time we make an evaluation. We have criteria, and when you write your evaluation, you're going to form the same criteria or the same types of criteria, and each person may have different types, uh, particularly depending on what the topic is. For the topic of parenting, your criteria might prioritize the child's uh, psychological stability over their socialization. Hopefully, everyone prioritizes safety above all, but maybe not. And there could be an argument for that, in which case you would need to make that in your paper. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, just kind of introducing you to what's coming. So, what makes an evaluation? You have an introduction. This is where we're getting into a much more formal academic essay as compared to the informal academic essay that we wrote with the autobiographical narrative. So, start with your introduction. This is where you talk about the subject that you're going to evaluate, and you have your thesis statement at the end of the introduction. It's much more formal in that way. Like the autobiographical narrative, your thesis statement didn't necessarily have to be in the introduction, but it certainly needed to be in the paper somewhere by the conclusion. In other words, the reason that you wrote about that story was your thesis. Here, it's much more formal, where you usually have your hook in your introduction, you introduce it just a tiny bit, and then, of course, you give your thesis statement. The second uh, section of your essay will be devoted to the description of the subject. Before you get into your argument completely, you want to a little more formally introduce your reader to the subject. You don't really want to put this all in the introduction. It's a bit more information than you would put there. In the introduction, you're really just kind of briefly introducing it. You're mentioning it. You're getting their attention with it. In the description of the subject is where you are going to actually talk about what it is that you are discussing. In this case, this would be where you talk about the parenting method and what it is and what it kind of entails, almost like a very brief summary of it. Then we get into the strengths and weaknesses discussion, which is where you're going to talk about your evidence as to whether your evidence that backs up your evaluation of that parenting method. And that's going to be your much longer section. This is the more of the body of your essay. So about at least 3 paragraphs or so. And then finally, you're going to go into your conclusion where you present, again, your overall judgment, your evaluation of the subject, and wrap it up. Basically, restating your thesis and maybe even uh, having a classic conclusion about, redirecting it towards the audience, asking them what they think. But that is a basic evaluation. Now, I have this also in the color coding, since I'm so fond of color coding it. Actually, I kind of like this because it is a good visual. Uh, shows us here that there are actually 2 different ways of approaching this evaluation, and we're going to go over both. And really, it's your choice as to which one you like better. Both of them have the introduction, where you're introducing your subject and you are giving your thesis statement at the end of the introductions. Both of them have the description of subject, again, where you're going to actually talk about what it is that you're talking about, just a brief summary of the topic. And then you're going to have your strengths and weaknesses features. And this is where the two uh, versions kind of differ. In the first one, you can talk about the different pieces of evidence, in other words, your different features, the evidence that you're using to back up your argument in your thesis statement. Um, you can talk about them each separately, feature 1, feature 2, feature 3. And you would talk about all the strengths and weaknesses of feature one, all the strengths and weaknesses of feature two, and all the strengths and weaknesses of feature three, thus separating them out separately, and then going into your conclusion where you restate your thesis and give your overall evaluation. Um, Obviously, if you are for something, you're going to emphasize the strengths over the weaknesses. If you are against something, you're going to emphasize the weaknesses over the strengths. Now, I know it is entirely possible in a real life situation, say in a career situation, that you would evaluate something and it would be fairly neutral evaluation. That's fine. But for our purposes, for this essay, you're going to have to take a side. Either you're for a parenting method or you're against it. And you'll have to show why from the evidence that's in the article that we're going to be reading. But this is a next week thing. In the second rendition of an evaluation essay, you have the introduction, description of subject. But when you get to the strengths and weaknesses, instead of separating each uh, piece of evidence, each point of evidence out separately to discuss them, you're going to discuss all the strengths in one section, all the weaknesses in another, and then you're going to weigh the strengths versus the weaknesses in the third part of the essay. In other words, this is where you really make the determination as to whether or not you are for or against the parenting method that you're going to decide on. So, again, just two different ways of actually talking about the strengths and weaknesses in an evaluation. Um, Really, whichever way that you want to use is up to you and what you think works better for your situation. Some people really like talking about all the strengths and weaknesses separately. Some people like discussing all the strengths at once and all the weaknesses at once. Um, Honestly, I've seen it done both ways. Both are good. And what really matters is that you use the three pieces of evidence that are going to support your actual evaluation, your thesis statement. But this is here for you to refer back to, and I'll probably refer back to it next week when we go back into talking about evaluations. So those are the effective, basically basic features of evaluations. We're going to go over introductions and other best practices later. But for our purposes this week, we're going to keep it easy. It's going to be chapter 17, questions and comments here. And this assignment will count for the attendance for the week. So be sure that you get this done. So we do next Saturday. I believe it's the only assignment for the week, but we'll double check that. Just going to click on chapter 17, and it's actually fairly interesting. It's all about how to write evaluations and the different types of evaluations. Uh, they do give you an example of an evaluation here in the Killers of the Flower Moon. Uh, I want to say it's basically like a movie review, and it's actually kind of interesting. I want you to read through it. You don't have to really uh, answer any questions about it, but it gives a good idea of what an evaluation is. And then after that is the key features of evaluations. This is actually the real meat of the chapter that I really want you to get into. So if you have questions and comments about the uh, example there, I would just kind of maybe try to focus your questions and comments not so much on the Killer of the Moon essay, but the features of after it that are talked about, because these are what's important. And then finally, there's a brief guide to writing evaluations. If I could get my cat off the keyboard. Sorry about that. There we go. Um, Choosing something to evaluate, well, that's going to be chosen for you, so you don't have to worry too much about that. But all of this information here is good about generating ideas and texting, comparing and contrasting, acknowledging other viewpoints. Obviously, you're going to have to acknowledge that somebody somewhere thinks that it's a good idea or a bad idea. Uh, and you can go into that briefly because it's not really the focus of your evaluation. It's more of what you think of it based on the article that you're going to have. But be sure to read all the way through this. And then that's pretty much it for chapter 17. Key features important. The next section, the Joel Robinson essay is good, but it's really just an example of an evaluation. And there you go. One last thing I wanted to make sure that I mentioned is the recommended reading for this module is right here. And let me make that visible to you. What I have here is another movie review. Uh, it, this is actually a review of The Phantom Menace, and it is a good evaluation. And it talks, and I just want you to see what that looks like again. So we have two movie reviews because those are actually one of the best ways to show you an evaluation. If we found a more technical evaluation for things that you might actually see in real life, that's, I don't know, I think it's too much for this. But this just gives you a good idea of what we're talking about when we talk about evaluation. So again, for this week, we only have chapter 17, but be sure to read through the recommended Star Wars The Phantom movie article and chapter 17. If you have any questions for this week, be sure to email me. Otherwise, have a great week.